Hello ladies and gentlemen, Willie here. We're getting very near to our 1-year classic anniversary now, aren't we? Feels like it's been no time at all for me. And I wouldn't still be doing these videos if it weren't for your guys' continued and amazing support for the channel. I don't say it as often I should, but thank you, all of you, for being here and continuing to watch the videos. Do consider dropping me a sub and a like if you like what I do, and I'll keep doing it as long as I can. You ever wonder what Classic would look like if it were actually released today for the first time and players actually found out everything that exists already in the game today? As in, if this game were actually still actively developed instead of just kind of maintained by Blizzard. What do you reckon Blizzard would have taken out of the game by now? Because there are certainly more than just a few things that I can think of that are used to break the game pretty heavily. And it's just a little follow-up from the last video as well. What we're playing now is essentially Classic Plus in my opinion, or as close as we're going to get to it. That is vanilla WoW content, but trying to fit into a modern era of min-max culture, player knowledge, and overall mismatched balancing between then and now. And it's a bit like trying to fit a circle into a square-shaped hole. It just doesn't quite fit. Of course, many of these issues were addressed in TBC and brought into line, because especially come Nax Rammus, it was becoming more and more popular for the top level guilds to require their raiders to perform at a high level and farm gold more or less incessantly to consume up and be at their best for raid time. That knowledge at the top end was definitely a bit more held in secret, with guilds actively holding strategies back for bosses to maintain their top spot on the server, as well as there just being less information online, which was so rapidly spread. But even when it came to just the top players taking advantage of everything possible to break the game, it was still nerfed out in time in TBC. So imagine we took the vanilla dev team and ported them back through time to today. What metas do you think they would break now? Number 1, world buffs. It had to be top of the list, right? Without a single doubt, the power levels these buffs give to players is disproportionately high. They change up the class power levels in raids significantly. A fully buffed character is comparable to entire tiers worth of gear apart from somebody who is missing them, and they make bosses melt in under 1 minute in most cases, sort of like rather large quest elite mobs that drop some nice purple gear. And just as of recently, a new category has been added to Warcraft Logs Classic, so we can actively see just how much of a difference having full buffs makes in a raiding environment. And just eyeballing it, seems like there's roughly on average about a 30% difference between a person with full world buffs compared to without, which sounds about right to me as well. And though I'm sure you'll agree there isn't really specifically a need for you to gather up all of these buffs on a weekly basis and throw yourselves into the negatives of the system, like the time investment, the risk of dispels, the fact you have to spend all of your time logged out to preserve these precious buffs, and whenever your raid is on a Dark Moon Fair week with that extra 10% damage thrown in, and you stack on top every single consumable that your class can use, you will easily be performing twice as effectively in your role compared to somebody who hasn't taken advantage of all of these things. On top of this, these buffs are available to everybody, full duration, full power, and I know when I've been leveling, especially by warrior or rogue, I'd go out of my way to head back to Stormwind to pick up the Elixir buff and then fly straight down to Booty Bay to get the CG buff too. They're just too good to miss out on, especially when both of them last a full 2 hours. That's 2 hours leveling as if you were playing a Twink, and it really does make it a lot more enjoyable. That's probably a bit more of a PvE server thing though a PvP player with all of these buffs is going to be considerably stronger as well, but they're not usually used for that purpose. And then we have the fact that world buffs only give melee attack power, sorry hunters, that's another thing to add to the pile of weak scaling. And then there is a horde only world buff which players can get from being mind controlled in the Crossroads or Orgrimmar, that being Warchief's Blessing. And the actual idea of dropping faction when under a mind control was actually patched out in TBC as well, by the way. Here are a few words from vanilla dev Kevin Jordan on the intention for world buffs.
So the original idea was there was no oversight for it. It was just a bunch of dudes making content that was cool. Like, oh, I'm going to put in this thing that you can repeat and get a cool buff for a while. Nowadays, I can't understand why guilds require them when the content is so old and so figured out, and is it really helping that many people get over the line?
That's it, just something someone thought was cool to add as a little bonus for completing a quest. You can see he's kind of at a loss for how far people go to min-max with them too, especially given how easy the content is, and world buffs are extremely rampant to pick up at least a few for the vast majority of guilds, I think. I can tell you people aren't doing it to get over the line to beat the content, they're doing it to do things as fast as possible. Your raiding for the week isn't centered around progress in the current tier, it's more like doing a world tour of every raid to get gear for later raids. Bindings from Molten Core, Crossbow, Tia, CTS, Locomere from Blackwing Lure to name a few, and now all the class books from AQ20, the rep from ZG for the enchants as well as the idols, and now all the new gear on top of that from AQ40, and we don't even have Nax Ramish yet either. Just like world buffs, do you have to do all of these raids? No. Do most people still do the majority of them week to week? I think so, yes, if they are in a raiding guild. Even still, I think if Classic were actively developed, world buffs would have been given a tone down in some way, as evidenced by the way they were completely removed in TBC to no longer work on characters above level 63. They create an environment where the content is easier than it needs to be, force players to log out once buff, and require players to AFK in cities waiting for a buff to drop. They needn't be totally deleted, they could still be a fun buff. Perhaps it could have just been for the player handing in, or shorter duration, or just straight up disabled once you enter any raid instance. In any event, I don't think world buffs would still be a thing back then if they were as rampant as they are now. Which brings me to the second part of the stuff that makes raiding very easy list. The power of consumables in vanilla. I think this deserves its own spot aside from world buffs, as the two of these things together contribute for an enormous amount of your player power. Unfortunately, we do not have a no world buffs and no consumables category on Warcraft logs, and I wouldn't really expect that one to exist. I mean, are you really going to ask people not to bring at bare minimum some health and mana pots to a raid? After all, it is a raid, a big scale encounter. It fits very well into the RPG theme that your character should prepare for the fights ahead, preparing their weapons, potions and so on. But the amount of power that your consumables give you in Classic compared to any other iteration of WoW are so ludicrously off the charts, it's insane. First of all, everything stacks. Elixirs, food buff, drink buff, weapon buff, blasted lamp buff, winter spring buff, protection potions that last an hour, flasks, and then you've got your on-use items, free action potions, grenades, ellipse, sappers, resto pots. The list literally goes on. And well, it turns out when you stack all of these items up, especially on top of your world buffs, you have some kind of Super Saiyan level power character. Here's a quote from Ian, back from Vanilla from the Elitist Jerks forums, about the relative power of consumables. Consumables are too powerful, such that Blizzard's raid designers are forced into an untenable position of bouncing around unbuffed groups and having their content steamrolled, or bouncing around buff groups and forcing players into a cycle of unpleasant farming in order to even have a chance. Imagine back then if they knew players would be downing Distilled Wisdom as the world's most expensive mana potion in today's speedruns. That's flask potting if you'd never heard of it. You can click off your flask and then drink a new one to instantly gain 2000 mana, with only the basic GCD and your in-game wallet as a restriction on how often you can do this. Even if I were to log on my paladin now, who has pretty good gear going into AQ, I would say, and check my MP5 compared to the values I can get from just bringing along some basic consumables, it's a night and day difference. The biggest offenders in this consumable category though are easily flasks. They are just so insanely over the top power-wise. Flask of Supreme Power had to be nerfed from 150 down to 70 spell power in TBC, and even in Wrath the Lich King, Flask of the Frostworm was not as powerful as our current spell power flask. Imagine that. Moving on to, of course, our good friends the mages. It had to be brought up sooner rather than later, didn't it? More specifically, the ways which mages have worked out how to pull entire instances in order to boost for gold or XP. Now, boosting has always been a thing in MMOs. Get friends or pay others to give you a fast track forwards for items or levels or whatever you like. It's social and it's part of the game. Absolutely, I agree. But I think there comes a tipping point to that where you can do a bit too much perhaps. It's hard to exactly say when that is. The Zul'Thrak farming between the ledges or in the graveyard seems borderline okayish. The BRD farms abusing the pathing in the area with a Shadowforge key or where Anger Forge is, perhaps that seems like it's starting to be a little bit much. And then we get to ZG or Mara, where people are either able to pull near all the non-ranged trash in the raid, or basically an entire dungeon worth of mobs to one location to AoE down. This was another thing addressed in TBC by AoE caps, which were a bit over the top restriction-wise since they made your AoE scale worse the more geared you got. But in vanilla, I think if mages were pulling quite this many mobs on a frequent basis to AoE down, I don't think it would be too long before some kind of change would be brought in to bring them back into line a little bit. There's a class having a niche and being good at something, and then there's this. As for the fix, that could be a little more complicated. Changing pathing, AoE caps or mob snapping are all pretty fundamental mechanics that affect a whole lot more than just big pulls from mages. Perhaps the talents that allow this kind of activity like Permafrost or Improved Blizzard would be the ones under the nerf bat instead. Number 4, pre-mades. Now for some focus on Battlegrounds, the main PvP content that Classic WoW has to offer. I'd imagine by now we've all heard about how rolling solo in a Battleground is really rolling a set of dice to see whether you end up versus a stacked pre-made or not. Fact is, you're almost required to pre-made once you start hitting the higher ranks, unless you are happy to PvP quite literally 16 to 18 hours a day for potentially weeks, so that you're able to complete your honor cap for your server's bracket in an efficient manner. And this varies between servers of course, but it tends to be a thing at the higher ranks. Some pre-mades go through the whole ranking process with a high 90% in the win rates, only ever getting put up to a challenge versus other equally geared and organised pre-mades, while solo queuing players get the brunt of the farm, sitting in their graveyard with a great screen. It's kind of a loss for both sides of the player base in terms of an actual good PvP game. The only winners are the people who want to honor cap and not look at another battleground for the week, which sort of brings into question, is the gear really that worth it for you then? I think at this point if Classic were still actively developed, something would have changed to give a bit more competition in Battlegrounds. And yes, I know you can say it's a social game, if you don't like pre-mades, just pre-made yourself, but at the end of the day, it's hardly fun for either side as is at the moment. It's not really a good medium, I think. Just putting a cap on the number of players that can pre-made would break up these vast win rates quite a bit more, as in no more than say 20% of a battleground can be players who have joined as a pre-made, so 2 for Warsong Gulch, 3 for Arathi Basin, and 8 for Alterac Valley. There would still be pre-mades going, but they would be broken up into so many more battlegrounds. Queue times would go down, games should overall be more competitive on average, and your skill as a player should be able to shine through a bit more rather than being rolled by 10 or so rank 12 plus players with full consumes. And number 5, class balance. I have a little saying that I strongly believe in when it comes to balancing for games, well, just in general actually, but especially for the class balance in MMOs though. A game doesn't have to be perfectly balanced so long as it is actively balanced. It's a delicate thing to get it right though. You don't want a constantly revolving door of something being OP one week and deadweight the next, nor do you want one single class or strategy to be the best for months and months. It's fine for something to have its time to shine and be OP, but there should be a sell-by date on that where it can be toned down or other classes brought up to that level. We're playing on a 1.12 server, yet from the first iteration of vanilla on 1.0 all the way to where we are at now, there were dozens upon dozens of class changes to be had across the board. Were this game still in active development, I have no doubt that in particular, for example hybrid DPS specs would have been made stronger, many mana costs would be down across the board by now. And you may say, well, that's what happens in TBC, but what will happen in TBC is this cycle will repeat itself with the new OPs rising to the top, and whilst it is the case, that doesn't mean we don't currently have a framework in Classic in place, where classes have the potential to undergo rebalancing without fundamentally changing anything or just tacking on random abilities from later expansions. In retail at present, Blizzard have stopped doing major class changes during the expansion, and I dislike it equally there too. Having a swap up in power dynamics is always a part of the game that I enjoyed and made me want to go and test those changes firsthand. In any event, these are a few of the things I feel an active Blizzard would have had a second look at and maybe made some changes to. Imagine if we had a classic with no world buffs, nerf consumables and class rebalancing to some degree. It would have been interesting, for sure. Anyways, what did you think of all this? What do you reckon Blizzard would have changed by now if they were so inclined to do? Hit me up below. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. If you like what you see, do give the video a like and subscribe, as there will be plenty more to come. Take care guys, and I'll see you in the next one very soon.